Just to start things off, I'd like to know how you first envisioned your installation in the MFA exhibition looking. Where did that concept begin?
Oh man, that one's really hard for me because I was flying blind for a long time. I knew, so before I started this thesis work, I had been pretty heavily invested in large scale fabric installations that were mostly dependent of crocheting with large chunks of fabric, large yarn that I made out of used bed sheets. And I that process started my second year and then into the first semester of my first year. But by the time that winter break came, I felt like I had sort of completed all that I wanted to get out of that medium. And I sort of joyously embraced the idea that, like, what if I let go of everything that I've done before this moment and just like let myself have a complete blank slate. And so that was terrifying, and also like very liberating, because it was nice to not look at the pieces that I had made before that time and try to like demand a certain image of them as the final thing. Like, I just feel like thesis is already loaded with a lot of pressure, and like you built up this imagination of like, how it's going to be like so consequential and like the be all end all, and it's supposed to represent all these things. And I just sort of wanted to let go of that and see like what happens if I just viewed it as a time, like a very concentrated amount of time between the last bit of my last work and like entering into a new phase, and just use that as like like basically a sprint versus like the marathon that I was thinking about before. And so I decided that before winter break, and then during winter break, me and my partner rented a minivan that had been converted into like a living space minivan, and we drove it from Asheville out to Utah and went to see double negative, sun tunnels, and spiral jetty. And those three works of land art have been like massively influencing to me, like, forever, since I've like learned about land art and minimalism. And Richard Smithson in particular is one of my heroes. And so it was just this really incredible adventure to like go out and live in this little van and like stay at these crazy little RV parks and make our way as fast as we could to Utah. And I also have never been west of Kansas. So I've never seen that landscape before, and landscape has a lot to do with my work because I'm just gratefully, like, massively influenced by place and my situation in place. So yeah, I drove out there and I just sort of let my mind be transformed by like the visuals that I was seeing, the landscapes that I was seeing, the ruralness that I was seeing. And I had already this investigation that's been a long standing investigation as just my life as a human around issues of like working class and class solidarity and labor rights and labor ownership. And I did a lot of work in new economy projects before I came to grad school. And so I felt that as I was driving, because the benefit of driving is you do have that time to let your mind wander and like daydream a lot and like just have full dialogues with yourself as you're just like consuming images. And yeah, so I felt like that was sort of the catalyst of where the concepts of my work started to come in, because I was able to make a lot of connections between my experiences as a Southerner, my experiences within rural Appalachia, and then all of this other part of our country that like is considered flyover and has their own rural politics, but there's such similarities in how our economy treats people. And so I just kept making like these conceptual connections, and then I would figure out ways to make visual connections. And then I came home and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I have all these pictures and I'm super excited about everything. And I feel like really inspired. So it was really about how do I like get out of my own way and like just put something in my hands to like let all of it come out, and then figure out after I started to produce it, like what they mean to each other, what they could look like, how they could be positioned, and things like that. So I really almost purposely placed myself into a position where like how it was going to look was like the very last consideration.
Yeah. And you mentioned this like just as you were answering that about how you draw inspiration from place. And I was just wondering how this concept of place and memory affecting like the self, how's that influenced your perception of the natural world? Like when you were on this trip, how has like your thesis kind of impacted the way that you see the world?
Hmm. Um, I think it. So my thesis ends up being like situated around these two words of cheap and worth, and cheap for a long time had been sort of in the back of my mind. I started on this thesis process of figuring out like what my work was really about halfway through my second year. And I would do these like really large charts, and I would do a lot of like brainstorming and brain dumping and like word mapping, and I kept coming back to this space of this idea of cheap, and like how cheap is sort of this catch-all phrase that is in itself really misleading. Like cheap is defined by somebody else constantly. Like if it's a sailing or like some sort of exchange, if I offer you a cheap good, that's a definition that I project on it, or it's a definition that the market projects on it. But if you take away capitalism, cheapness doesn't mean anything. And so there's this space where cheap is this like interesting, like lucid, hard to grasp idea, but it's also been used in our society to hide the true costs of things. And I've been deeply aware of that as being someone from Kentucky, and I have a deep love and commitment to anti-mountaintop removal and anti-coal efforts. And there is a lot of conversation about it's not just the environmental harm of coal, it's that the costs of it are never reconciled. Like the costs that it produces in the erosion of the land, and it produces in the erosion of the people's health around it, the amount of extraction of wealth that is taken out of communities, like it's never ever spoken of. And it's this idea, because all of that gets wrapped into the idea that it's cheap resources, it's cheap electricity. And so even as I existed years ago in that space, like that cheapness always felt like this just paradoxical idea, and it felt like a forced upon idea that wasn't defined by the people affected by it, but defined by the people that used it and benefited from it. So traveling out, I think how it started to respond to me and thinking about the larger universe other than the central Appalachia and the coal belt was that there is lost measurables of labor and costs throughout the entire system. And there's so many expenses, and I mean that in an expansive term of like literal financial expenses, but also like sacrificial expenses that people have to deal with in order to carve out a life for themselves in rural conditions. And holding that concept while looking and exploring rural farms in Utah versus rural farms in like Lexington, North Carolina, like that, there's a massive difference in the actual like makeup of the landscape, but the conditions and how they've been taught to think about themselves within this society that views that type of labor as completely disposable and utterly replaceable is so the same. So I think it started this idea that like the critique of ruralness is a larger and more common idea across the state, where I as a Southerner have been so fixated as like what the South means and what the South is, the legacy of it and the legacy of justice movements here, and also like the Southern identity as like opposition to a lot of other identities, like, you know, how much classism and racism is like assumed of the Southern identity. And so, you know, we end up being like a scapegoat for a lot of the country's like larger problems, versus like seeing this as a space of like continual resistance, where like the people fighting the fights down here should be the ones like leading the charge and be like held up the highest, because it's such hard work and they're doing it so well. So, you know, I've just had that sort of like, it's not like a defensive thing, but it's been more of a tunnel vision identity of like the struggle. And it's really easy on the East Coast, like even if you're a little inside of it, to have like just a northern southern dichotomy conversation. So pushing west was just it just expanded everything, and then it really solidified, which wasn't new to me, but it felt more valid, this idea of like class conflict, like mass connective class conflict. So that was a really long rambling way of answering that question.
Yeah, just definitely interesting points, and it's really interesting to hear how it all kind of came together for you.
Yeah.
So my next question is, what do you believe your art offers to those experiencing it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, what do you hope it offers?
I mean, this question is always a hard one to answer for me, because I produce art because I need a vehicle to process my theories and my ideas and my reflections, and I'm like, verbal communication and language, written language, has always been like a challenge for me, as feeling like a good vehicle to find that kind of expression. So, you know, I feel like I'm going to make art more because I need it in order to like function as a good human being in the world. And that is always first and foremost. And so the idea of like what people take from it is sort of secondary, if I ever consider it at all. And I know like that sounds, I don't know, that sounds cold and like selfish, but I don't know, like it's self-care. It is
Self-care is never selfish.
Right. It is selfish endeavor. But you know, what my work has revealed to me, I think, is like what I would hope that it would reveal to other people, which is this: it has been an opportunity for me to reevaluate, reconsider my own self thoughts of worth and self thoughts of like value of my own labor and my own positioning. And I do hope that that if there is a opportunity within the work, that it comes down to that people will have an opportunity to reinvestigate their own ideas of worth and their own ideas of cheapness and disposability, and like where they fit in that continuum. And you know, that's like my like academic response. My other response is that I am a revolutionary, committed to revolutionary struggle, and everything I produce is propaganda around that because it comes from me. And so I want to add to like the fuel to the fire of people feeling like they deserve to take the like means of production, that they deserve to own their labor, that they deserve to have a life within a system of economics that is actually fruitful for them, that it isn't filled with like sacrifices and dehumanization. And that's the dream, like that I could somehow like help continue that fight. And that is not new to me. I'm not nearly the first person to do that. Like, I'm just a blip upon the continuation of that. But that's like how I try to live my life, in that kind of servitude of I want working class people to view themselves as meaningful and worthwhile and deserving of the fruits of the struggle. Because I feel like if we can't believe in ourselves, then we're never going to win. And I want us to win. I need us to win.
I hear you. Is there anything else regarding your work in the exhibition that you'd like to share that I haven't asked about?
I don't know. I like glittery things. I don't know.
The glitter played a big role.
Glitter. Yeah, the glitter is important. No, I think one thing that would be, I think, useful to like have a conversation around is that there is like a multi-layer conversation that's happening. So like I've spent time today talking about like my revolutionary roots that come into this, and where I align myself in that struggle. This idea of like producing art as a residue of me trying to understand things, but then you can't divorce it from the fact that like I am a very like educated art student. I've dedicated my life to this. I got a BFA from Micah. Like I've spent my time here, deeply in study of the practice of art. I teach the practice of art. Like, so there is a element in there that is very art historical. It is having this larger conversation about sculpture and the movements within sculpture, the movements that I'm very attracted to, which a lot of it comes out as minimalist artists, because I think minimalists have this, I'm fascinated with it because their idea of the object is so dismissive as it is fetishized, and there's such a contradiction there that it's just like really captivating. And they also had this big emphasis on labor, but a lot of them chose to not use their own labor to produce the works that they created. So there's like this contradiction there. And they're just like the people that I have the most conversations with in my brain. Like one of the pieces in there is totally the result of me sitting with Donald Judd in my head for like a year and a half, because Donald Judd is fascinating in that, he created these objects that I think, because of his use of color and his use of recognizable materials, are some of the most approachable art in the minimalist movement of that time. And because so much of it, like any conceptual art, it's, if you're not coming with it with a background information of what is happening during the time period as these artists are making it and how they're in conversations with each other, you can get turned off of it. And I know a lot of like, as we continue to cut art education, so many working class people leave high school, leave college without a good basis of an art history education, and they walk into these galleries and they have pieces that scream back at them that they're not like allowed into this conversation, that they're not, the accessibility into them is not considered in that way. And I really am interested and dedicated as a teacher to bridging that gap for my students and figuring out ways to create access points to that space. But going back to Donald Judd, I think he's one of those people that you don't have to know what's going on. You don't have to have an investigation of the cube to be really attracted to his pieces. And this is why it works in corporate situations in a lot of ways. And we can have that critique later. But, like they're accessible, but at the same time, he also carried with him this like really interesting analysis of like, where does the labor movement have to do with art? What does unions have to do with art? Like, what does anti-war efforts have to do with art? And he develops this critique that like rides right up to the line of where I think we should be as working class people in solidarity with these activities. And then right when you think he's gonna grasp it, he like totally goes the other way, and you're like, you're so close. So I've become like really fascinated with him. And and there's a piece that is totally, it's one of those things, like if people read it, that's like amazing, and you must live in my head in order to read it. If you totally don't catch it, like that's fine, but it's like my little Easter egg of like, oh, I made Mo's versions of Donald Judd boxes because I'm having this constant conversation with him. So that I feel like that was important to also flag, because I don't want to ignore where I'm at, like as much as my life has produced this, my politics has produced this, like this is also, 7 years of deep study. And that should also be considered and not hid, because I'm not trying to pretend that I'm not, that I don't carry the education that I carry. So, that would be it. I feel like that's a weird response to be like, I don't know, think that I learned something, but that's where